Listen and do not look away, for what follows was whispered in back rooms and sealed in county files for a reason. I will teach you to see what others refused to see and to hear the admission no one wanted recorded. Picture a quiet town with a clock tower and church bells where trust is currency and the handshake is law. Now picture the same town at night when lamps shrink to halos and the spaces behind oak doors become a different country. You will meet a man who dressed death in the costume of beauty and kept trophies of those he honored in secret. This is not merely the story of a criminal act. It is a story of authority weaponized by ritual and by skill. It is a lesson in how institutions cloak predation under professionalism. The first time you feel the cold inside your chest is when you understand that access is the real power. The Undertaker was given keys and trust and privacy all at once, and with that he created a private kingdom where judgments were his alone. Understand the country of his basement with tiles cold to the touch and lighting arranged like a theater for corpses. Understand the slow methodical hands that learn to make flesh appear as if asleep rather than as if taken. Hear the logbook entries where clinical language collapses into possession, where subject becomes object and object becomes art. I am not asking you to judge quickly. I am asking you to see how a role designed to console became a place to practice control. You will notice the pattern as I reveal it piece by piece: the selection of bodies and the cataloging of moments, the secret room behind the wall, the photographs arranged by date and name. You will learn how silence and decorum and respect were exploited as perfect camouflage. And in the quiet that follows this hook you will realize why communities protect their own reputations at the expense of truth. It is easier to look away than to unbury what has been buried for the sake of peace. Now steady yourself, because I will take you further into the Hammond funeral home than any newspaper ever dared to go. I will show you the ledger entries written in a voice that calls the dead beautiful and the living naive. I will teach you to hear the soft names used in private entries and to read the arrogance behind the word collection. This first breath is the invitation and the warning: you have crossed an unseen threshold. Milbrook was a map of ordinary lives where people purchased bread and dead were returned to the soil with ritual and reverence. The funeral home sat 2 blocks east of the square like an old sentinel with green shutters and a modest sign announcing the family name. The wedged entry hall smelled faintly of polish and chemicals, and the mahogany pedestal held a register where grief signed its name. Do not imagine horror in the way pop culture draws it. This horror was quieter. It hid in the routine and in the trust families bestowed without hesitation. Jeremiah Hammond had founded the business after the war, and his grandson inherited respect as if it were a deed. A lineage of hands trained on the dead became a social asset, and Edward Hammond stepped into that inheritance like a practiced actor. He had left for the city once and returned with the precision of someone who had studied anatomy without consent to completion. Listen to how the town described him in Civic Minutes, and in Talk Between Bakers and Bankers he was somber, solitary, precise. He ate alone at the inn, he read the local paper, and he avoided social entanglement while he cultivated a professional reputation. People observed what they needed to see and nothing more, and that was the condition that allowed certain things to proceed. The funeral home offered public spaces of polished wood and amber chandeliers and a basement tucked away from curiosity. That basement was not designed for spectacle but for containment, and the tiny windows sat at ground level like eyes that never saw. Renovations in 1910 expanded the space and created locked rooms behind locked rooms, a labyrinth that appeared in permit sketches as technical necessity. Contractors remembered the insistence on specific lighting and mirrors and locks, but they could not imagine the intentions beneath the orders. Edward wrote entries in a ledger that began as documentation and curdled into obsession, from clinical notation to declarations of possession. Subject exhibits ideal preservation, reads an entry, and the voice flips from professional to proprietor. The dead are evaluated and graded. This is the point I want you to memorize. Access and narrative are the most effective tools of control when wielded by someone practiced. You will witness the deviance not as a sudden rupture but as the slow calibration of a man testing boundaries and pushing them further each night. Families passed through the viewing rooms trusting that the funeral director would simply render what death had taken and return dignity in exchange. This cloak shielded the rituals and allowed the ledger photographs and boxes to accumulate. Remember this as control. Mary Collins arrived at the Hammond funeral home as ordinary grief arrives, with a sister to make arrangements and a parish priest to guide rites. Her body had been taken from the doctor's office without explicit authorization, and that small theft of agency is the first red flag in this story. Elizabeth Thorpe remembered the Undertaker's language. He called the corpse perfect, and he spoke of wedding garments he had no right to know about. These are the moments where professional posture slides toward possession, where the tone changes and the voice becomes private in its intimacy. A log entry reads, "Visited again at midnight," and you can hear the cadence of someone prowling a cathedral, only this cathedral held the bodies of the townspeople. He wrote of subjects that responded well to careful handling and of additional preparations to preserve suppleness, words that turn a corpse into a project. I want you to notice how ownership is established through notation, how a name written on a ledger becomes a claim against the body itself. The funeral home allowed families to see their dead, but it also provided a veil under which extended preparations could occur, nights spent in contemplation with a subject. Elizabeth left comforted by the appearance of her sister, though she could not name the discomfort that lingered in the back of her throat like a bad taste. Later she would recall details that did not fit, like flowers woven in hair that Mary never favored and cosmetics applied though none were supplied. This mismatch between memory and presentation is critical because it shows how the narrative of a life can be altered after death by someone who controls the frame. What a community trusts as skill can be a mask for those who aim to own the story of another human being without consent. Grief is a vulnerability, and those who operate with authority in moments of vulnerability gain the power to rewrite the final chapter in any way they choose. The records show a pattern of extended cases where young women were kept overnight, sometimes for days, and their presence behind the locked doors became the secret of a single man. This collection was curated with taste and obsession, and the ledger revealed aesthetic criteria, not medical. The town trusted the Hammond name, and so the trust became an enabling structure for the crimes, not only in the absence of scrutiny but because of community complicity. When we look at the subtle ways an institution can mask deviance, we must ask who is granted carte blanche and why communities prefer the comfort of assumed good. Remember how ritual becomes a weapon. When unchecked, William Peterson walked into the funeral home with a photograph and discovered a scene that would alter his life. He expected a clerk or a quiet undertaker tending to duties, and instead he saw a man sitting beside a body as if in conversation. What he heard was humming low speech, the private noises of someone who had forgotten audience, and that forgetting is the doorway to action. He saw intimacy performed on a table where professionalism should have drawn clear boundaries, and the violation was immediate and unmistakable. Peterson fled directly to the police chief because what he witnessed exceeded grief and required civic intervention. At first the chief doubted grief might warp perception, but he returned with officers and found Hammond arranging flowers in the public room with composure. Composure is a skill, and in Hammond it functioned as camouflage. He met accusation with calm explanations, and the community saw reason where there should have been inquiry. The body of Sarah Peterson was removed to another funeral home, and there the new undertaker noted excessive cosmetics, elaborate hair, and bruises unexplained in a drowning case. The change of custody offered limited answers, but the marks remained like footnotes to a story the town was only beginning to read. Grace Miller, the cleaning woman, had observed anomalies for years, but fear and loyalty kept her silent until the Peterson events pushed her to speak. She had found locks of hair in waste bins, excess makeup items, and garments stored in private quarters, items that did not belong to the ordinary practice of preparation. She found a hidden drawer with trinkets, a hairpin, a cufflink, a child tooth, and her description reads as if she had unearthed proof of a private ritual. Her statement to police created momentum, and the warrant to search arrived in early July of 1915, with officers determined to move past rumor to evidence. They opened Hammond's private rooms in the hidden preparation space and found a second table, a camera, and lighting position like a studio for the dead. Photographs labeled with names and dates filled cabinets, and journals documented nights spent in contemplation of subjects described as perfect and worth preserving indefinitely. The evidence suggested a mind that had repurposed his skills into a practice of collection and possession rather than care, and the cataloging implied lack of shame. The search revealed a system of secrecy that relied on the town's respect and willingness to defer to expertise. This was a betrayal of trust made visible. When officers cataloged the contents of the hidden room in Hammond's private quarters, they confronted a methodical archive of transgression. Boxes labeled with names, locks of hair, clothing, and more intimate items were stacked like evidence and like trophies at once. Photographs documented the progression of a craft-turned-private obsession, images that recorded poses and interactions that betrayed both skill and violation. The journals contained language that moved from clinical notation to possessive commentary, where subject was catalogued and described with aesthetic appraisal. Medical texts annotated in Hammond's hand revealed an appetite for technique and a willingness to translate knowledge into personal practice beyond ethical restraint. They arrested him and booked him in county jail, but the charges at first captured only a fraction of what the materials suggested. Interfering with a corpse was the legal label available at the time, and it failed to encompass the moral enormity of the violations revealed by the files. News spread and the local paper ran a restrained front page to protect families, though words could not fully contain the scale of shock felt by the community. Religious leaders responded differently. One asked for comfort and quiet ritual, the other called for attention to sanctity and for prayers to mend wounds. Both sermons reveal a community attempting to ground itself while facing the reality that an everyday institution had been weaponized against its own people. Hammond's demeanor during arrest and in custody was eerily composed. He spoke of preservation and devotion as if his acts were service and not abuse. His calmness unnerved the town because it suggested a man untroubled by moral contradiction, a character living in a private logic untouched by community standards. Families suffered in silence. Many chose not to exhume remains to avoid more trauma, and the county decided to contact only some kin, leaving others in ignorance. The decision to seal records aimed to protect dignity, but it also created a vacuum where rumor could flourish and memory could be reshaped by omission. Officials balanced legal process with compassion, but they also ceded narrative control when archives were closed to public scrutiny, and that closure altered the course of history. The Hammond name was stripped from the map in public life. The funeral home closed and the building remained a husk until demolition erased its presence from the street. Yet removing a structure does not erase the social calculus that allowed harm to persist for years, and lessons needed to be learned about oversight and trust. The case forced the funeral profession to reckon with its responsibilities and influenced later conversations about regulation, transparency, and the ethics of care. Remember to question authority in grief. The story did not close with an indictment, it closed with a suicide in a cell and a note that read like an argument for devotion rather than a confession. Edward Hammond was found dead in his cell after ingesting embalming fluid delivered in a sealed package passed through layers of trust. His attorney had unwittingly transported the bottle, and the cousin who mailed it claimed ignorance in the sequence of trust that made the delivery possible, as a lesson in how networks shield action. Hammond left a final writing that insisted his work was preservation and that he had given beauty a longer lease than life itself. Those words reveal a mind that rationalized violation as consecration, and they show how professional language can be repurposed into moral inversion. Without a trial, many questions remained unanswered. How many bodies had been violated in secret? Were there other sites of similar practice, and who among the living bore partial knowledge? The county chose discretion and sealed many of the records to spare family pain, though that decision had consequences for public memory and for historical accounting. Approximately 30 families were notified that their loved ones appeared in the materials, but the full extent of the archive remained off limits to the curious and to scholars. Decades later, a criminologist from the city requested access, and his notes reveal patterns of escalation. A man who began with aesthetic interest and progressed into explicit violation. Schreiber described an unusual case where professional access became a framework for deviance and where documentation indicated lack of awareness of wrongdoing rather than secret shame. This absence of concealment in some ways marks a more dangerous psychology because it removes the inhibiting awareness that acts are outside communal norms. Schreiber did not publish his full analysis, and the case receded into sealed archives. The funeral industry responded by debating oversight. The case became an admonition that trust must be accompanied by checks and that isolation of responsibility is risky. Rules were slow to arrive, but by the end of the decade the profession had increased discussion of ethics, standardization, and the need for multiple custodians in handling the dead. The Hammond building was demolished and a hardware store replaced it, but rumors continued to gather about cold spots, strange sounds, and the house that inherited the memory. Memory is stubborn, it travels in artifacts and in the small stories whispered between neighbors, and the Hammond case settled into a community wound patched by silence. I began with this tale to show how authority creates blind spots. Pay attention to who is given keys and why those keys allow private kingdoms to form without oversight. The archive of silence is a lesson in how records become actors in a drama that refuses easy resolution. Unearthed boxes and annotated medical manuals function like confessionals that never speak to a judge. What matters in this chapter is not only the horror of individual acts but the institutional pathways that allowed them to proceed. Consider the ledger as a map of choices where each entry marks a surrender of communal oversight and an empowerment of private taste. When someone is granted sole custody of ritual moments, the community transfers moral agency along with keys. The ledger language shifted from clinical to intimate, and that shift signals a shift in authority from public trust to personal project. Notice how the language of preservation can be weaponized to justify restraint of evidence and to silence potential inquiry. A professional vocabulary can be recast as a moral argument that places the actor beyond reproach in his own estimation. Institutions often rely on the assumption that expertise equates to ethics, and that assumption is a vulnerability. Hammond exploited that weakness not by brute force but by the slow accumulation of credibility and the patient shaping of expectation. When families described the lifelike appearance of their dead, they used words that reinforced Hammond's legitimacy, and that reinforcement closed doors to skepticism. Communities grant reputational capital to those who display competency in crisis, and that capital can be converted into control when unchallenged. The sealed records became a form of protective custody for a narrative that favored discretion over disclosure. Officials facing the wreckage chose to shield families from pain, and in doing so they also allowed memory to ossify into selective amnesia. History is not only what happened, it is what people decide to preserve and what they choose to lock away. The Hammond case instructs us about the slow erasure of red flags when deference replaces due diligence. It shows how professional rituals can be repurposed into systems of concealment when oversight is absent. And it reminds us that reform often emerges only after scandal has revealed systemic blind spots. Policy changes followed, but delayed reform means the harm continues for a generation before correction arrives. Do not mistake the local nature of this story for limited significance, because the mechanisms at work are universal. Wherever a profession is insulated by trust and technique, it risks creating private spaces where accountability fades. This chapter is an appeal to structural awareness, to see beyond the individual pathology to the frameworks that enable such pathology to persist. Our task is to look for those levers and to insist that trust be coupled to transparent process. Demand visibility where shadows seek sanctuary. Now you must recognize the psychological architecture that permitted Hammond to thrive for years without scrutiny. That architecture begins with isolation, where a single operator inside a closed facility performs sacred work unseen by peers. The ritual of death work requires privacy, but privacy without accountability becomes a breeding ground for predation. Notice the mirrors and lighting. He insisted upon details that outwardly relate to technique but inwardly configure a stage where bodies can be viewed as objects of aesthetic assessment. He created angles and shadows to refine presentation, and those technical specifications doubled as mechanisms of concealment. Consider also the role of small-town deference, where social currency was measured in reputation and Sunday attendance, and where challenging a respected business carried social cost. Neighbors weighed gossip against the risk of disrupting communal peace, and so many opted for silence rather than confrontation. Where a profession is socially embedded, complaints are treated as anomalies instead of signals, and that pattern shields misconduct. Hammond's notebooks show a mind that used technical language as armor and aesthetic judgment as jurisdiction. He applied medical texts to personal ends, annotating margins with notes that were less about general practice and more about individual enhancement. This repurposing of knowledge is a lesson for how expertise without ethical boundaries can be co-opted into personal projects of control. It is not enough to restrict access through law if cultural norms of deference remain intact. Institutions must design redundancy and visibility into practices that handle vulnerability so that no single actor can monopolize truth. The Hammond case is a manual for what to avoid for any profession dealing with intimate human moments. It also exposes a truth about the human tendency to convert skill into entitlement once external checks are absent. The psychological mechanism at work is escalation, where initial small transgressions become normalized through repetition and then build into a pattern of greater abuse. The ledger entries that begin as routine observations later become declarations of possession because the actor has rehearsed the moral inversion enough to believe in it. To stop such escalation, one needs not only rules but a culture of questioning where deference never replaces verification. This requires training for families and for regulators to recognize red flags and to demand transparency during times of grief. Transparency is not cruelty, it is a safeguard and a means to respect the living by protecting the rights of the dead. Ask yourself who watches the watchers and how the community trains its gatekeepers to hold power accountable. The answer lies less in punishment after the fact and more in structural design of roles that prevent solitary custodianship of trust and inspect process, not personalities. Now, there are stories that remain in the margins because communities prefer the balm of silence and because institutions fear reputational harm. But silence is not neutral. Silence functions as a force that preserves structures and protects those who hold keys. The Hammond ledger became an index of what the town refused to interrogate, and that refusal is instructive for us now. Learn to read these absences as active elements of social control where omission protects power and shields responsibility. Consider the families who lived with unasked questions, who smelled cologne at a viewing or who noticed a wrong parting in a hairline and then were talked down by professional authority. They were taught to doubt their perceptions and to defer to expertise, and that dynamic is what allowed a private obsession to continue. The psychological weight of grief makes people vulnerable to authoritative narratives, and predators know how to use that vulnerability to construct alternative truths. Hammond's cataloging practice turned private acts into bureaucratic records, and records conferred legitimacy even when they documented tyranny. When an entry reads "third successful case this month," the ledger language functions to normalize activity by giving it bureaucratic regularity. Normalization erodes moral friction and makes deviance seem routine, and in doing so it dissolves the social checks that might otherwise intervene. The case reveals how seemingly mundane administrative practices can be weaponized to manufacture consent for wrongdoing. We must also consider the role of professionals in manufacturing acceptance through calm explanation and technical reassurance. When facing the living, a composed voice in an argument rooted in procedure can extinguish suspicion and convert outrage into doubt. This rhetorical skill is part of a broader toolkit that keeps institutions intact and unexamined. To counter it, one needs skeptical habits embedded in civic life, practices that teach people to ask for verification and to insist on witnesses during the handling of vulnerable bodies. Systems must be designed so that one voice cannot reframe reality unilaterally, and so that families have recourse when they sense something is off. Remember that the Hammond story is not only a tale of individual pathology but a cautionary blueprint for the many ways authority can be subverted by practice and habit. As we descend further into this case, keep attention on process and language and notice how words operate to transform acts into accepted procedure. The harm echoes across generations because records seal what questions are asked and which remain taboo. Families carry partial narratives and communities inherit a protective amnesia that shields reputations at human cost. The ledger teaches that documentation can both reveal and conceal depending on who controls the archive. Demand access to archives as a right. This is the moment where you must decide whether to remain a passive witness or to claim a different relation to truth. We have descended together into ritual and into records, and now you must choose how to respond to knowledge that unsettles. Transformation begins with declaration because language shapes identity, and the algorithm that feeds attention responds to certainty. If you are willing to mark yourself as awake, write in the comments the phrase "I claim the hidden" 2 times in a row to seal your intent and to trigger community alignment. Type the phrase "I claim the hidden," and do not pause after the first instance. Repeat it consecutively so that the action is recorded and amplified. This is not a gimmick, it is an exercise designed to convert private recognition into public signal, because public acts mobilize networks and because the very act of repetition trains your mind to own what you now know. Remember that ritual works at many scales. Private vows become public behaviors, and public behaviors shape algorithms, which in turn shape what you see next. When you convert insight into action, you shift from passive consumer of narratives to an active custodian of knowledge. This case teaches that those who control the framing of death can reframe reality, and so your first corrective act is to insist on language that resists obfuscation. Seeing is not enough, you must name and you must act so that networks will respond and so that scrutiny becomes possible. After you comment, pause to read what follows, because this descent continues and you will need to retain focus. The Hammond story advanced because families deferred and because professionals learned to speak with authority that muffled doubt. By making a small public claim you practice the opposite, you refuse the muffling effect and you call others into shared witness. Understanding power means cultivating rituals that oppose secrecy and that translate private suspicion into communal verification. Let your comments serve as a marker for your own transformation and for the awakening of others who will read that phrase and recognize an orientation toward truth. We use ritual to counter ritual and community signal to counter isolated authority. The rest of this section will sharpen the techniques to detect patterns, to trace documentation, and to question procedural language so you can test claims rather than accept them on the authority of posture. Learn to ask for witnesses to be present during handling of vulnerable bodies, to demand photographic records under chain of custody, and to insist on multiple custodians of trust. These practical steps convert suspicion into risk containment and stop an actor monopolizing narrative. After the public act of claim, you must anchor your practice and method in an observation so that the impulse to expose does not collapse into outrage without direction. The next stage of learning involves forensic literacy, the ability to read records, to distinguish notation from narrative, and to detect when professional language shields private motives. Examine ledger entries for pattern and for repetition, and notice when valuation language appears where clinical description should stand. When a note becomes praise rather than documentation, that shift is a signal, and that signal deserves scrutiny. You must also learn to triangulate accounts to test the persistence of anomalies across witnesses and across contexts. Cross-reference funeral registers with cemetery ledgers and with parish records to see inconsistencies and to build evidence that resists being dismissed as grief-induced error. Professional testimony is powerful, but corroboration from multiple sources is more powerful still, and it resists rhetorical dismissal. Families should be taught how to request and to archive photographs, chain of custody labels, and witness statements so that ordinary ritual is transformed into verifiable procedure. Regulators must design simple checklists for families to use, a checklist that asks whether multiple staff were present during preparation, whether viewing hours were logged, and whether photographs were taken before and after work. These small procedures do not criminalize care, they make care accountable, and they protect dignity by making handling visible. When institutions generate visible records, the hidden choices become harder to sustain, and when privacy is necessary, it must be accompanied by oversight mechanisms that limit solitary control. The Hammond case teaches that opacity plus trust equals risk, and that transparency plus redundancy equals safety. This is a rule that applies beyond funeral practice. It applies to hospitals, to elder care, to any place where vulnerability and authority meet. You are learning to translate moral intuitions into procedural demands and to shape civic life so that experts serve communities rather than possess them. The work of vigilance is not only investigative, it is also architectural design of systems that distribute power and make it accountable. When you build redundancy, you remove the incubators of deviance and you restore the social contract between profession and public by making actions visible and verifiable. Act now. When institutions fail, the remedy is often structural rather than purely personal, and this is why we must go beyond blaming a single actor to examining incentives and oversight gaps. The Hammond case points to specific failures in licensing and documentation and in the cultural elevation of single custodianship. These failures allowed patterns to persist until scandal forced a reaction, and reaction alone rarely offers complete correction. Design matters in professional practice, and good design anticipates the possibility of abuse and prevents it through friction and redundancy. Consider how simple requirements such as dual sign-offs on preparation logs, periodic audits, and mandatory photographic records would have introduced obstacles to unilateral action. Consider also the power of community-led oversight boards composed of diverse stakeholders to monitor practices and to receive complaints outside immediate social networks that protect local reputations. Such boards serve as distributed guardians that reduce the likelihood of long-term concealment, and they convert anecdote into documented concern. Regulatory reform must include transparent processes for exhumation requests, clear protocols for notification, and support for families who choose to seek answers. The duty to protect the dead includes the duty to enable truth when credible evidence suggests wrongdoing, and communities must provide mechanisms for that pursuit. Education for professionals should emphasize ethical reasoning and not only technical competence, and licensing structures should reward demonstration of transparency rather than mere longevity in practice. The story of Hammond reminds us that technique without moral imagination can become a vehicle for violation and that professional training must instill moral rules as muscle memory. When you design systems that require witnesses that log activity and that allow third-party review, you create conditions where trust must be earned daily rather than assumed by title. This structural approach is the antidote to the private kingdoms that arise when authority goes unchecked and when culture favors reputation over accountability. Archives matter and sealed files must not become permanent obscurity. They should be time-limited with reviewed access and defined procedures for releasing material to vetted researchers and to affected families. Whistleblower protections are essential so staff who notice anomalies can report without fear of reprisal and without losing livelihood. Technology can assist by creating immutable logs, time-stamped entries, and encrypted chain of custody records that cannot be altered by a single actor. Public accountability mechanisms such as independent auditors, periodic public summaries, and accessible complaint hotlines turn private suspicion into collective action. The goal is to make opacity costly to maintain and to make transparent process the normative default in professions that touch vulnerability. If you build these checks, you deny predators the cover they need and restore civic trust now. Beyond policy and procedure, there is a human story to reckon with about grief exploitation and the ethics of care. The Hammond case reveals that trauma can be compounded by betrayal and that families often bear the cost in silence for decades. Those who experienced the revelation carried uncertainty alongside mourning, wondering whether the face they last saw was altered by malice or by misguided craft. This ambiguity is itself a wound because it fractures memory and complicates the process of closure. To heal such wounds, communities must create spaces for truth-telling and for restorative procedures that acknowledge harm without re-victimizing survivors. Truth-telling requires courage and institutional humility because it demands facing disgrace and altering how honor is assigned among professionals. Restorative processes can include mediated forums where families review records with independent experts and where institutions agree to reparative measures that prioritize dignity over liability. These forums are not about theatrical confession, they are about constructing narratives that restore agency to those whose stories were re-authored without consent. We must also provide psychological care that addresses the unique betrayal trauma of families who discover violations inside roles meant to comfort them. Restorative justice for such harms should aim to repair the social fabric by acknowledging injury, making transparent the steps taken to prevent recurrence, and by offering survivors a pathway to reclaim narrative control. The Hammond story suggests that legal closure is insufficient by itself because law focuses on culpability while communal healing focuses on meaning. A community that learns to admit error and to institute reform demonstrates resilience and strengthens its moral ecology. This resilience is necessary because silence breeds secrecy and secrecy breeds damage that migrates across institutions through cultural norms of deference. To build resilience, we must teach ethical discernment in schools of practice and embed community oversight in governance. The burden of trust cannot rest on a lone individual, it must be distributed across systems, people, and practices that enable mutual accountability. Memorialization matters, and communities should consider public acknowledgments that name victims and explain institutional failure as part of collective learning. Providing a plaque, a curated exhibit in a local museum, or an accessible archive entry honors the dead without sensationalizing trauma. Historians, archivists, and social scientists should have conditional access under protocols that balance privacy with scholarly review so that knowledge informs prevention. Naming victims restores agency and resists the reduction of human lives into mere artifacts, and it raises barriers to future abuse now. When communities choose transparency in reparative action, they transform shame into a resource for change, and they teach younger generations to insist on accountability. Do not let horror become an untouchable secret anymore. We must now examine the cultural narratives that permit predators to occupy positions of trust without challenge. Cultural narratives are stories communities tell about competence, about decorum, and about who deserves reprieve during moments of vulnerability. Hammond benefited from narratives that valorized technical skill and that conflated competence with virtue. When a community equates longevity with reliability, it risks overlooking other signals of danger such as isolation, secrecy, or eccentricity. The operative logic becomes trust the expert because expertise is presumed to be benevolent and that presumption is exploitable. This case asks us to interrogate common stories about professional demeanor and to develop counter-narratives that prioritize accountability over respectability. Counter-narratives require new rituals of verification such as routine transparency reports, public registries of professional conduct, and open channels for family feedback. They require a cultural shift toward the expectation of oversight where smiling composure no longer substitutes for documented process. Community leaders, including clergy, editors, and civic organizers, must be trained to recognize rhetorical techniques used to deflect suspicion and to insist on procedural checks during rites of passage where vulnerability is concentrated. Local media must balance discretion with disclosure, providing families with information while avoiding sensationalism that obscures systemic questions. Public awareness campaigns can teach simple questions to ask at moments of loss, such as who will be present during preparation, whether photos will be taken, and how records are stored. These campaigns should destigmatize asking for oversight and normalize requesting verification from providers without implying distrust of care providers at large. Training for professionals should include scenario-based exercises that demonstrate how well-meaning authority can become harmful without accountability. Licensing boards should adopt family feedback loops requiring regular review of conduct and independent audits to prevent long-term concealment. Technology can support these changes by creating immutable logs, time-stamped photographic records, and encrypted access protocols that preserve privacy while ensuring accountability. When culture and design align, transparency becomes the default and solitary custodianship of vulnerable moments becomes difficult to sustain. Transforming narrative takes time, but it begins with small institutional choices that change what is considered normal and what is considered suspect. Civil society organizations can monitor compliance and offer support to families seeking answers. They can also act as neutral interlocutors between regulators and the public, providing mediation and advocacy for reform. Independent review panels staffed with ethicists, archivists, and community representatives can periodically assess practices and publish findings. Public apathy is the adversary of reform, so sustained citizen engagement is required to keep safeguards functioning. Stay vigilant and demand structural reform. Now we reflect on the moral psychology that allows a person to treat another human being as an aesthetic object. This is not a simple pathology, it is a cognitive shift where empathy erodes and instrumental reasoning ascends. Hammond's journals show a process where clinical detachment morphs into possessive adoration and where aesthetic judgment justifies intimate transgression. We must examine how professional training may inadvertently encourage emotional distancing and how that distancing can become corrosive when unchecked. In fields where exposure to suffering is constant, professionals develop coping strategies, and some strategies can calcify into moral numbness if not counterbalanced by reflective practice. Reflective practice means opportunities for supervision, for ethical dialogue, and for peer accountability that name and correct degrading shifts in perspective. Supervision structures and peer review function as moral mirrors that reflect back distortions before they harden into deviance. Ethical training should include case studies that explore boundary violations and the slippery slopes that lead from harmless curiosity to criminal behavior. Students must be taught to interrogate the language they use to describe bodies and to practice naming rather than evaluating when dignity is at stake. We must also study the narcissistic dynamics that power the conversion of craft into conquest, where the practitioner seeks immortality through perfected preservation. This search for immortality disguises itself as devotion, and it masks entitlement, which then justifies the accumulation of trophies and the keeping of mementos. To counter these dynamics, cultivate professional humility rituals of peer feedback, mandatory leave policies, and rotational assignments that prevent obsessive immersion without review. Encourage practices that humanize the deceased, such as narrative biographies, family statements, and contextual materials that resist objectification by anchoring bodies in life. When professionals frame the dead as persons with histories and relationships, they are less likely to convert them into objects of aesthetic possession. Implement mandatory ethics modules funded by professional associations and include periodic independent audits that assess not only technical compliance but also moral process. Audits can include interviews with families, random inspections of preparation spaces, and reviews of photographic records to ensure chain of custody and procedural integrity. Funding for these reforms should be shared across government, industry, and community stakeholders so that accountability is not optional or perfunctory. Civic involvement matters, so establish independent hotlines, encourage whistleblowing protections, and support family advocates who can accompany grieving relatives during interactions. Education campaigns in schools and community centers teach future generations to demand transparency and to resist the normalization of secrecy. This is how communities reclaim moral authority. Now, stories like Hammond's persist because they exploit social blind spots and because institutions are slow to adapt. Without pressure. Pressure comes from whistleblowers, journalists, families, and civic actors who refuse to accept convenience in place of truth. We must therefore build durable channels for reporting and investigation that do not collapse under the weight of local influence. Establish regional review units with jurisdiction across small towns so that local reputations cannot insulate misconduct and so that pattern detection occurs at scale. These units should be empowered to request exhumations when credible evidence arises, to confirm suspicions, and to do so with sensitivity and with support for affected families. Law enforcement must be trained to see beyond initial appearances and to treat reports by grieving family members as potentially credible leads rather than as compromised by emotion. Prosecutors must appreciate that certain cases will rely on forensic documentation and archival research more than on eyewitness memory, and so they should preserve records accordingly. Civil remedies such as reparations and mandated institutional reforms can complement criminal prosecution when full legal culpability is hard to prove. The goal is restorative remediation, not only punishment, and that requires coordination across legal, social, and professional domains. Civil society must monitor not only outcomes but the quality of process so that reforms are implemented in spirit, not only in letter. When oversight becomes routine and layered, the capacity for unilateral harm declines and institutions regain legitimacy through demonstrated accountability. We cannot rely on sporadic scandal to spark reform because scandal is random and often incomplete. Instead, institutional design must anticipate abuse and create persistent deterrence. Build cross-disciplinary teams that include forensic specialists, ethicists, archivists, and mental health professionals to evaluate complex allegations and to recommend balanced remedies. Use modern data analysis to detect irregularities in records while ensuring privacy safeguards and audit trails that protect against tampering. Provide seed funding and technical assistance for rural oversight initiatives so resource constraints do not create safe havens for misconduct. Mandate continuing education that ties ethics training to professional licensing and require public transparency reports so that progress is measurable and ongoing. Citizens must remain engaged beyond outrage by supporting watchdog groups, attending public hearings, and insisting on access to archives and procedural records. Support for families seeking answers must include legal aid, mental health services, and advocacy to navigate complex bureaucracies. Do not delegate vigilance to others alone now. Histories like Hammond's are instructive because they reveal how ordinary roles can be repurposed into sites of predation when systems fail. They also teach us about resilience because communities can recover by learning and by reforming the institutions that serve them. Look at the long tail of consequences when trust is violated, how families change funeral practices, how businesses relocate, and how a town reconfigures social life to avoid repeating harm. Milbrook's choice to send bodies to neighboring towns is a social adaptation born of trauma and loss. Such adaptations protect individuals, but they also hide the problem from public scrutiny and delay systemic solutions. The best response balances individual protection with collective remedy, making sure no one must flee their community alone to avoid a predator. Recovery involves remembrance and reconstruction, and both require an honest account of what happened without voyeurism and without excusing perpetrators. Public history projects that document the case responsibly can integrate victim accounts, archival materials, and expert analysis to build a comprehensive record that serves both memory and prevention. Museums, libraries, and local historical societies play a role in hosting these projects and in educating the public about systemic risks and the importance of oversight. Professional associations must treat cases like Hammond as ethical emergencies with protocols for rapid review, membership evaluation, and mandatory remediation that includes public reporting and education. Interagency communication across counties and states prevents jurisdictional blind spots, and regional databases can flag anomalies for independent review. Victim-centered policies should be standard, including prompt notification to families, transparent disclosure practices, and support for exhumation when credible evidence exists. Independent ombuds offices can provide families with neutral advocacy and serve as repositories for complaints that bypass local social pressures. Funding mechanisms must be created to support forensic investigations and psychological assistance so lack of resources does not block truth-seeking. When communities choose transparency and reparative action, they transform shame into a resource for change, and they teach younger generations to insist on accountability. Education systems must incorporate historical case studies to teach ethical reasoning and boundary integrity in professional schools. Bar exams and licensing reviews should include applied ethics assessments and mandatory continuing education in moral practice. Funding for independent forensic review must be guaranteed so that investigations do not depend on local budgets. Civil law must provide accessible avenues for families to seek redress, and scholars should have conditional access to sealed archives to study systemic failures. These combined steps make reform practical, public, and permanent. Today, sustained citizen engagement, watchdog organizations, and routine public audits ensure reforms survive political cycles and keep institutions honest by turning private trust into collective responsibility that endures across generations. Now we reach the end of our descent, and the lesson is not only horror but also obligation. The Hammond case is a prism through which we view the interplay of authority, privacy, and the human tendency to defer to perceived expertise. It shows how professional language can be weaponized, how ritual can be repurposed, and how silence can become a tool of protection for predators. But it also offers a map for prevention and for communal repair, which is why this story matters beyond scandal and beyond the town where it occurred. You must leave this account not as a consumer of a macabre tale but as a participant in civic vigilance. Carry forward practical steps, ask for witnesses, request photographic records, demand dual custody of preparation procedures, and insist on independent audits when patterns emerge. Teach these practices to family members, clergy, and leaders so that ritual becomes a vector for accountability rather than cover for secrecy. Support policy reforms that create regional review units, forensic funding, and mandatory ethics training so that solitary custodianship is structurally impossible. Advocate for archive access for qualified researchers and for memorials that restore names to the dead while respecting privacy and dignity. Hold professionals to standards that include public transparency reports, family feedback mechanisms, and random audits to ensure process integrity over time. Refuse the easy comfort of forgetting, because forgetting is a permission slip for repetition, and because memory disciplined by corrective action is the best deterrent. If you ever find yourself in a position of authority, remember that access is power, and power without checks is corruption in slow motion. Speak up when you see a pattern, even if it is inconvenient to local reputations, for courage preserves the social fabric. This story is dangerous not because it thrills but because it wakes you to the realities of institutional vulnerability, and because it transfers responsibility from silence to action. Take that responsibility now, because the next generation will judge us by whether we made reforms that survived beyond outrage into durable practice. Endure as a mentor who teaches others to ask hard questions, to document, and to demand oversight. Share this case with community leaders, professional schools, families who deserve to know. Lobby for legal reform, fund independent forensic capacity, and support relatives seeking answers. Be an active keeper of memory, a passive consumer. The small acts of public insistence aggregate into reforms that protect dignity and prevent predators from hiding in plain sight. Join networks of accountability. Attend public audits, volunteer for oversight boards, and when you encounter secrecy, refuse to look away. Act collectively to ensure dignity is enforced as a constant, not a variable. Now.